Spring arrived gently at the edge of the vast estate, brushing the gardens with color and life. Yet the mansion itself stood untouched by the season, its tall windows shuttered against warmth and its stone walls holding tightly to a lingering cold. The gravel path leading to the entrance seemed rarely disturbed, and even the wind passed over the grounds without invitation, as though the place had forgotten how to welcome anything alive. Paused at the wrought iron gates, her fingers tightening slightly around the worn handle of her small suitcase. At 21, she had already learned that hesitation rarely changed one's circumstances, yet something about the estate pressed against her instincts, urging caution. Still, necessity outweighed discomfort. With a steady breath, she pushed the gate open and stepped inside, her modest shoes crunching softly against the gravel as she made her way toward the towering doors. She had been told little about her employer, only that he was young, wealthy, and difficult. The wages were generous, far more than she had expected for cleaning work, and that alone had been enough to silence any questions. Now, standing before the grand entrance, she wondered what kind of man required such isolation at such a young age. The door opened before she could knock. A tall figure stood in the dim interior, framed by shadow rather than light. He could not have been much older than 24, yet there was nothing youthful in the stillness of his posture or the cool sharpness of his gaze. His expression held no curiosity, no welcome, only quiet assessment, as though measuring her usefulness before acknowledging her presence. "You're late," he said, his voice even but edged with impatience. Blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She had arrived precisely on time, but she lowered her gaze instead of correcting him. "My apologies, Your Grace." He stepped aside without responding to the apology, allowing her to enter. The air inside was noticeably colder, carrying the faint scent of dust and something long undisturbed. The vast entry hall stretched upward, its high ceilings and polished floors reflecting a beauty that felt hollow rather than grand. "Your duties are simple," he continued, walking ahead without checking if she followed. "You clean, you keep to your schedule, you do not interfere." Adjusted her grip on her suitcase and moved after him, her eyes briefly taking in the silent corridors branching from the hall. "Yes, Your Grace." He stopped abruptly, turning just enough to face her. For the first time, she saw his features clearly, sharp, composed, and distant in a way that felt deliberate rather than natural. "Don't get attached to me," he said, his tone unchanged yet carrying a weight that settled heavily in the air. "You're only here to clean." The words struck harder than she expected, not because of their harshness, but because of their certainty. There was no arrogance in them, only a firm boundary drawn long before she had arrived. Bowed her head slightly, hiding the flicker of hurt that rose uninvited. "Of course, Your Grace." He studied her for a moment longer, as if expecting resistance, then turned away again. "Your room is on the lower floor. Supplies are already prepared. Begin today." With that, he left her standing in the center of the hall, his footsteps fading into the quiet until even their echo disappeared. Remained still for a brief moment, letting the silence settle around her. The estate felt less like a home and more like a place paused in time, waiting for something that had long since passed. She exhaled slowly, then straightened her shoulders. She had not come here for warmth. Her assigned room was small but clean, tucked away near the service corridors. After setting down her belongings, she wasted no time. Work, at least, was something she understood. The first room she entered bore the marks of careful neglect, furniture polished but unused, curtains drawn tight against the light, and a thin layer of dust dulling every surface. She moved methodically, opening the windows despite their stiffness, allowing fresh air to slip inside. Sunlight followed, hesitant at first, then stronger, spreading across the floor in quiet defiance of the gloom. Room by room, she continued, her movements steady and purposeful. She did not rush, nor did she linger unnecessarily. Yet in each space, she made small, deliberate choices, adjusting a curtain to let in more light, straightening objects that had been left askew, creating order where there had only been stillness. By midday, the estate had begun to change in subtle ways. It was not brighter in any grand sense, but the shadows no longer felt as heavy, and the air carried a hint of movement rather than stagnation. She found a neglected vase in one of the sitting rooms and paused, considering it. Outside, she had noticed the early blooms of spring pressing gently against the edges of the garden. After a brief hesitation, she stepped out, gathering a small handful of flowers, nothing extravagant, just enough to bring a touch of color indoors. When she returned, she placed them carefully in the vase and set it near the window, where the light could reach them. It was a simple act, one that required no permission, yet as she stepped back, she felt a quiet sense of defiance settle within her. She would do her work as instructed, but she would not let the place remain lifeless if she could help it. Unseen by her, from the far end of the corridor, the Duke had paused. His gaze fell not on her, but on the room she had just left, the open window, the softened light, the unexpected presence of color against the otherwise muted space. His expression did not change, yet something in his stillness shifted, subtle and unspoken. He turned away after a moment, continuing down the hall as though nothing had caught his attention. But the air he walked through no longer felt quite the same, Morning light entered the estate more freely now, slipping through windows that had long resisted it, tracing quiet patterns across polished floors that no longer seemed abandoned. Moved through the corridors with practiced rhythm, her presence subtle yet undeniable, as though she had learned how to belong without asking permission. The air felt different, not entirely warm, but no longer suffocating, and even the silence carried a gentler tone. She had begun to understand the estate's unspoken rules. The Duke preferred distance, valued order, and tolerated no intrusion into his solitude. Yet she also noticed the contradictions, how he passed through rooms she had restored and lingered a fraction longer than necessary, how his gaze sometimes settled on small details before shifting away as if caught in a private hesitation. Never addressed these moments. She kept her head lowered when he appeared, her voice measured, her actions precise. Still, she allowed herself small liberties that could not be mistaken for defiance: fresh air, light, the careful arrangement of spaces that felt less like maintenance and more like quiet revival. One afternoon, while dusting a study lined with towering shelves, she found a door slightly ajar at the far end of the room. It was the only space she had not yet been assigned, and instinct told her to leave it untouched. Yet the faint chill that slipped through the opening suggested neglect beyond the rest of the house. She hesitated, then gently pushed the door wider. The room beyond was dim, its curtains drawn tightly, its furnishings untouched by time yet heavy with absence. A desk stood near the window, papers arranged with meticulous care, as though someone had once valued order deeply but had not returned to disturb it. A thin layer of dust dulled everything, untouched by her efforts elsewhere. Stepped inside, her movements slower now, guided less by duty and more by a quiet curiosity. She did not examine the papers or search for meaning in what did not belong to her. Instead, she moved toward the window and pulled the curtains apart. Light poured in suddenly, cutting through the stillness with almost startling clarity. "You shouldn't be in here." The voice came from behind her, low and controlled, yet carrying a sharper edge than she had heard before. Turned quickly, her hands instinctively falling to her sides. The Duke stood in the doorway, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed not on her, but on the room itself, now exposed to the light he had longed it. "I apologize, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the tension that settled in the air. "The room had not been cleaned." "That is not your concern." His words were immediate but not raised. The restraint in them made them more cutting than anger would have. She lowered her gaze, nodding once. "Yes, Your Grace." For a moment, neither of them moved. The light continued to spill across the floor, illuminating details that had remained hidden, faint impressions where objects had once rested, the subtle signs of a life interrupted rather than concluded. The Duke stepped into the room at last, his movements deliberate. "Leave it as it was." Glanced briefly at the open window, then back at him. "As you wish." She crossed the room quietly, passing him without another word. Yet as she reached the doorway, she paused just for a moment. "The light suits it," she said softly, not lifting her gaze. It was not a challenge, nor an argument, only an observation offered without expectation. She left before he could respond. The corridor beyond felt unusually still, as though the estate itself had drawn breath and forgotten to release it. Resumed her work elsewhere, her hands steady, her thoughts carefully contained. She did not regret her action, but she understood now that certain boundaries were not simply rules, they were shields. Hours passed before she saw him again. He entered the dining room as she arranged the table, his presence announced only by the faint shift in the air behind her. She stepped aside immediately, allowing him space, her posture respectful yet composed. "Did you finish your tasks?" he asked, his tone neutral. "Yes, Your Grace." A pause followed, brief but noticeable. "The room," he said, though he did not specify which one. "You will not enter it again." "Of course." His gaze moved across the table, noting the precise placement of each setting, the subtle symmetry she had introduced. Then, almost reluctantly, it shifted to the window, where soft daylight filtered through newly drawn curtains. "It is brighter," he said. The statement held no clear approval, yet it lacked dismissal. Inclined her head slightly, it seemed appropriate for the season. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he remained where he stood, his attention lingering on the light as though it presented something unfamiliar. "Spring changes nothing," he said at last. Allowed herself the smallest pause before answering. "Sometimes it does, Your Grace, even if only quietly." Her voice carried no insistence, only calm certainty. For a brief moment, something in his expression shifted, not softened, but unsettled, as though her words had reached a place he preferred to leave untouched. "You speak too much for someone in your position," he said, though the sharpness from earlier had lessened. She bowed her head. "I will be more careful." He studied her, perhaps expecting defensiveness, perhaps searching for something else entirely. Finding neither, he turned away. "See that you are." As he left, the room fell silent once more, yet the silence no longer felt absolute. Finished her work and stepped back, her gaze briefly lifting to the window. Outside, the garden stirred with life, each bloom opening without hesitation, indifferent to whether it was noticed. Inside, the change was slower, more fragile. But it had begun. And though the Duke walked the halls as he always had, measured, distant, controlled, he did not close the study door again that evening. The days that followed unfolded with a fragile steadiness, as though the estate itself had learned to exist between what it had been and what it was quietly becoming. Continued her work with the same careful precision, yet something in her awareness had shifted. She noticed more now, not just the dust that gathered in corners or the subtle imbalance of a room, but the rhythm of the Duke's presence, the patterns of his solitude, and the unspoken tension that lingered whenever their paths crossed. He no longer avoided the spaces she restored, yet neither did he fully enter them. Instead, he moved along their edges, pausing briefly before continuing on, as if uncertain whether he had the right to remain. His words to her remained measured, often brief, yet the harsh finality they once carried had softened into something less certain, less absolute. Recognized the change, but she did not allow herself to dwell on it. She had not forgotten his warning, nor the boundary it imposed. Whatever shift existed between them, it remained undefined, and she understood the danger of mistaking quiet tolerance for permission. One evening, as the fading light of day settled into a muted glow, she found herself once again near the study. The door stood open now, not wide, but no longer shut against the world. She paused only briefly before entering, her movements deliberate, respectful of the space she had once been told to leave untouched. The room had changed since she first stepped inside. The curtains remained drawn back, allowing the last traces of sunlight to linger across the desk. The dust had not returned in the same way, though it still gathered faintly along the edges, as if the room resisted complete renewal. She began her work quietly, careful not to disturb the arrangement of anything that appeared intentional. Yet as she moved, her attention was drawn to a single object resting at the corner of the desk, a small, framed portrait turned slightly away from view. She hesitated, then gently adjusted it, not out of curiosity, but to clean the surface beneath. The image revealed a young woman, her expression soft, her presence captured in a moment of quiet contentment. There was a familiarity in the way she was placed, not as decoration but as remembrance. "You were told not to interfere." The Duke's voice came from the doorway, low and controlled, yet carrying a tension that had been building long before this moment. Stepped back immediately, her hands still. "I meant no intrusion, Your Grace." His gaze fixed on the portrait, then shifted to her, sharp and searching. "Meaning does not change the act." "I understand." He entered the room slowly, his attention returning to the desk. For a brief moment his composure faltered, not visibly, but in the slight tightening of his expression, the restrained breath that followed. "That room was not meant to change," he said, though his voice no longer carried the same certainty. Lowered her gaze. "Nothing remains unchanged forever." The words left her before she could measure them, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any reprimand. "You presume too much," he said, though the force behind the statement felt diminished, as if directed more inward than toward her. She bowed her head further. "Then I will leave it as it is." He did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached for the portrait, his fingers brushing lightly against its edge before stilling. The gesture was brief, almost imperceptible, yet it revealed more than any words he had spoken. "Do you think presence replaces absence?" he asked suddenly, his tone quieter now, stripped of its usual distance. Lifted her gaze slightly, not fully meeting his eyes, but no longer retreating entirely. "No, Your Grace." "Then what is it you are doing here?" The question was not an accusation, but it carried a weight that demanded honesty. She considered her answer carefully. "I am doing my work." "That is not what I asked." The air between them shifted, no longer defined by command, but by something more uncertain, more exposed. Drew a slow breath. "I am trying to make what remains feel lived in," she said. "Not replaced, not forgotten, only less empty." The Duke's expression stilled completely, as though her words had struck something he had kept carefully contained. For a moment, it seemed he might respond, might challenge or dismiss what she had said. Instead, he turned away. "You are here to clean," he repeated, though the words lacked the finality they once held. "Nothing more." The reminder settled between them, heavier now not because of its authority, but because of its contradiction. Felt it clearly, the line drawn once again, not out of certainty, but out of fear. And for the first time, she understood that remaining within that line would not protect her as she had once believed. "Then I will not overstep again," she said quietly. There was no defiance in her voice, only a calm decision that carried its own weight. She moved past him, leaving the room as she had before, her steps steady, her expression composed. Yet something had shifted within her, something she could no longer ignore. The estate no longer felt distant in the same way. It had become familiar, almost personal, shaped not only by her work but by the quiet moments she had shared within it, and that familiarity had grown into something far more dangerous than she had intended. Attachment. The word lingered in her thoughts, echoing his warning with unsettling clarity. She had not noticed when it began, whether it was in the way he lingered in restored rooms, or the way his voice softened when he spoke without realizing it, or the rare moments when his composure revealed something unguarded beneath. But it had taken root nonetheless, subtle and persistent. And now it demanded acknowledgement. That night, as she returned to her small room, sat in stillness longer than usual. Her hands rested in her lap, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular as her thoughts settled into quiet resolve. She could not remain. Not if staying meant losing the clarity she had held when she first arrived. Not if every small change risked becoming something she was never meant to have. By morning, her decision had formed completely. She would leave the estate quietly, respectfully, and without expectation. And this time she would not wait for permission. Morning arrived with a clarity that felt almost deliberate, as though the world beyond the estate had chosen to move forward regardless of what remained unresolved within its walls. Sunlight streamed through the open windows attended so carefully, illuminating the corridors with a warmth that no longer felt out of place. Yet beneath that quiet brightness a stillness lingered, one shaped not by neglect but by impending absence. Moved through her final tasks with measured calm, her hands steady despite the weight of her decision. She did not rush, nor did she allow herself hesitation. Each room she entered received the same attention she had given from the beginning, though now her actions carried a sense of completion rather than continuation. The floors gleamed, the air flowed freely, and the faint fragrance of early spring drifted in from the gardens, softening the edges of a place that had once resisted change. She saved the study for last. The door stood open just as it had in recent days, no longer a barrier but not yet an invitation. Stepped inside without pause, her gaze moving across the room with quiet understanding. The light fell evenly now, settling across the desk, the shelves, and the small portrait that remained where it had always been. She approached it once more, not to adjust or clean, but simply to acknowledge its presence. The woman in the frame remained unchanged, her expression untouched by time, her place within the room undisturbed. Inclined her head slightly, as though offering respect to something she could never fully understand. Then she turned away. There was nothing left to do. By the time she returned to the main hall, her small suitcase rested by the door, its modest weight containing everything she had brought with her and nothing of what she would leave behind. She paused only briefly, her gaze lifting toward the high ceilings, the softened light, the quiet transformation that now filled the space. It no longer felt lifeless. That realization settled deeply, not as satisfaction but as closure. She reached for the door. "You're leaving." The voice stopped her before her hand could touch the handle. Turned slowly, her composure intact, though her breath caught for the briefest moment. The Duke stood at the far end of the hall, his presence as steady as ever, yet something in his expression had shifted beyond restraint. There was no distance in his gaze now, only a sharp awareness that seemed to hold her in place. "Yes, Your Grace," she said quietly. He did not move immediately, as though the confirmation had altered something he had not prepared to face. "You did not request dismissal. I believed it unnecessary." His jaw tightened slightly, the controlled composure he maintained faltering at its edges. "Unnecessary," he repeated, though the word carried more disbelief than authority. Held her ground, her posture respectful but no longer withdrawn. "My duties have been fulfilled. The estate no longer requires what I was brought here to provide." "That is not your decision to make." The response came quickly, yet it lacked the sharpness it once held. Instead, it carried something less certain, something closer to urgency. She met his gaze then fully, without lowering her eyes. "With respect, Your Grace, it is the only decision I can make." The silence that followed stretched between them, no longer empty, but filled with everything neither of them had spoken. He took a step forward. "Is this about what I said?" The question was quieter now, stripped of command, shaped instead by something he could not fully conceal. Considered her answer carefully. "It is about what I understood." His expression tightened further, not in anger but in recognition. "You were told your place." "Yes." "And yet you chose to ignore it." "No," she said, her voice steady. "I chose to respect it." The distinction settled heavily, shifting the meaning of everything that had come before. He closed the distance between them slowly, as though each step required deliberate effort. "Then why leave?" The question lingered, no longer a demand, but something closer to uncertainty. His fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her suitcase, because staying would mean wanting more than that place allows. The honesty in her words left no room for misinterpretation. For the first time, the Duke had no immediate response. His gaze searched her face as though trying to find something unspoken, something he could still control or dismiss, but there was nothing uncertain in her expression, no hesitation left to challenge. Only resolve. You think this is about position, he said at last, though the statement lacked conviction. It is about distance, she replied softly, the kind that does not change no matter how close one stands. The truth of it settled between them, undeniable. He exhaled slowly, the sound quieter than any command he had given before. And if that distance no longer exists? The words seemed to surprise even him. Did not look away, then it must be spoken, not assumed. Something in his expression shifted then, not gradually, but all at once, as though the careful structure he had maintained had reached its limit. The restraint that had defined him did not vanish, but it gave way to something far more vulnerable. I told you not to get attached, he said, his voice lower now, less certain, because I knew what it meant. She listened without interruption. I knew what it required, he continued, and what it would cost. His gaze faltered briefly, not in weakness but in honesty. I was not willing to risk that again. The admission lingered, heavier than anything he had said before. His expression softened, though her resolve remained unchanged. And now? He stepped closer, close enough that the distance he had once insisted upon no longer existed. Now I understand that it was never your attachment I feared, he said, it was my own. The truth settled between them, clear and unguarded. Silence followed, but it no longer carried uncertainty. I cannot ask you to stay as you were, he continued, his voice steadier now, nor would I. His grip on her suitcase loosened slightly, though she did not release it entirely. Then what are you asking, she said. He held her gaze, no longer distant, no longer restrained by the role he had imposed upon himself. To stay, he said quietly, not as someone who serves this house, but as someone who belongs in it. The words carried no command, only choice. Studied him for a moment longer, searching not for certainty but for truth, and for the first time since she had arrived, she found no barrier in his expression, no distance left to measure. Only sincerity. Slowly, she released the handle of her suitcase. The sound it made against the floor was soft, but it echoed through the hall with quiet finality. Outside, the garden stood fully in bloom, untouched by hesitation, shaped only by the certainty of change. Inside, the estate no longer felt like a place waiting for life to return. It had already begun.